Well, Atlantic Canada is well positioned to become a leader in the green hydrogen sector. Before we can lead, our region is going to have to address and ultimately get over some pretty big hurdles, like policy gaps, regulatory barriers, the high cost of green hydrogen, incomplete supply chains, public support, and perhaps most importantly, customers. So, in this episode of Atlantic Canada's Hydrogen Journey, we're going to discuss the headwinds and the hurdles that stand between Atlantic Canada's vision to become a green energy powerhouse and the reality of where we are today. To help us understand these hurdles and hopefully how to get over them, I'm joined on the podcast today by Arvind Ramakrishnan and Adam Langer. Arvind leads Deloitte Canada's hydrogen practice, where he works across the full hydrogen value chain from production through to end uses. He advises clients on hydrogen hubs, hydrogen technologies, and the policy landscapes that are helping shape Canada's clean energy future. Adam is the owner of Langer Public Affairs, where he specializes in public relations, government relations, and strategic communications. He has extensive experience in the energy and natural resource sectors in Atlantic Canada. And if you're interested in federal politics, Adam has also developed a model using historical election results and the most recent polling trends to project which party is going to win the next federal election, including in your local riding. If I remember, I'll put a link to his website in the show notes. And one more thing, if you're interested in Atlantic Canada's hydrogen future, check out the Hydrogen East Conference on April 14th and 15th in Halifax alongside the Smart Energy Conference. I'll put the registration link for Hydrogen East in the show notes. Arvind and Adam, welcome to the podcast. Arvind, Atlantic Canada has been here before. We've seen big energy projects like offshore natural gas, LNG terminals, even tidal power. Some of these projects took off and some didn't. So I'm curious what you think makes green hydrogen in Atlantic Canada different.
Thanks, Derek, and thank you for having me in the podcast today. That's an interesting question, and certainly there are lots of lessons that can be learned from LNG projects that had ambition out in Atlantic Canada and also out in the West. What I believe this green hydrogen or low carbon CI hydrogen makes different from LNG is a couple of different factors. One is that in this particular case, the buyer, in this case, the European Union and the member states have a desire to buy low carbon CI hydrogen, primarily driven by their policies for existing users in sectors like refining and fertilizer. So for this region, I believe Atlantic Canada, given its vast renewable energy potential, strategic location with access to Europe and markets, I think it presents great opportunities to be able to realize that ambition. So just quickly building off on some of those, I think the wind resource is strong and untapped offshore. Just creates a substantial opportunities to be able to add resiliency for the region, particularly wind and hydroelectric power, which can be harnessed. I talked about the strategic location. There is also this rising demand for green hydrogen in Europe, like I talked about through the policies, through the renewable energy directives. And then the last piece I would say is also that Canada is now learning the importance of diversification in trade and energy. Although US may be backing out of climate, but the global trading partners like EU, Asia are all prioritizing low carbon and products. So climate state change still continues to persist, and we'll have to make some adjustments. And by diversifying our trading partners, I think we can realize our economic resiliency and reduce dependency on a single market. So I would believe through a combination of renewed enthusiasm, policy support for expediting large-scale energy infrastructure projects reflects a significant shift in the energy, which seems to be a little different than what was previously experienced with LNG projects.
So given all of that, it seems that on paper at least, this should work. So why do you think the green hydrogen sector in Atlantic Canada isn't developing faster?
Yeah, and I think there is a couple of different factors, so we can unpack that. I would say the navigating complex permitting processes, attracting investment, the geopolitical uncertainty that we are seeing with trade war, inflation. I would say there is competition from other supply regions, and still the lack of long-term offtake agreements. So I think to build on some of those, I would say that the permitting processes can still be lengthy, can be time-taking, still continues to face, in many cases, opposition from local communities and environmental groups. The lack of still consistent long-term policy frameworks. I think anytime there is political uncertainty, it leaves a lot of investor uncertainty. The availability of credits like investment tax credits, the clean fuel regulations provide and play a very critical role in making green hydrogen projects financially viable. And even infrastructure development at the port, developing our export terminals and facilities for loading, transloading, storing, and the challenges required to meet international standards still continues to face challenges. Having said all of that, Derek, I do want to point out that while these are all challenges, there is still a lot of solutions which can be thought through. For example, in permitting, I think we are beginning to see and how can we expedite and fast track that, as we saw in British Columbia, whereby the BC government had assigned this to BC Energy Regulator. And there is a lot of talk about using technologies like artificial intelligence to be able to fast track permitting, including, again, as I talked about earlier, the need for Canada to stop to rely on diversifying our trading partners and to be able to accelerate these projects and send clear policy signals. So while there are still challenges in why these projects have not clearly taken off, I still do believe that these can certainly be overcome if we have the right level of policy support.
Thanks, Arvind. Adam, we hear a lot about policy gaps and regulatory barriers, but what does that actually mean? What policy or regulatory changes are we going to need to accelerate hydrogen development in Atlantic Canada?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Derek. Arvin touched on quite a number of them, and I think a lot of these challenges and changes have to do with the fact that this is a completely new sector, number one, and number two, development of these projects overlap a number of different sectors or governmental departments. You also have to deal with three levels of government. You have a lot of federal requirements, provincial requirements, and when you're, developing, for example, wind farms in communities, you have to spend a lot of time working with the municipal or local governments there. So that being that being said, it's clear that the federal government has indicated a great deal of support for the sector, and that looks like it'll continue. And here in Atlantic Canada, both the provincial governments of Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia, they've also been incredibly supportive, both vocally but behind the scenes in working with potential developers. So there is a lot of positivity and a lot of goodwill in trying to get this done. I think, given the complexity, the fact that it's a new sector, as well as the fact that you know a lot of this is going to rely on the hard work of civil servants through various levels of government. And anybody who's worked with the civil service can tell you these folks work really hard. They have a lot on their plates, and it's pretty rare that they get things taken off of their plates. So they also take their jobs and their responsibilities to their province or to their jurisdiction really seriously, which is great for all of us. We want those who are working as regulators to be passionate and professional about what they're doing. But that means that they're going to be making sure things are done properly, and sometimes that can be can slow things down a little bit. If
Right.
you want to look at a development project that perhaps sped maybe too quickly, well, look at Muskrat Falls in Newfoundland and Labrador. Um, there was a report issued on that a number of years ago, I think in 2020, that uh, really it was a scathing report of the performance and actions or failure of actions of civil servants. And I can tell you, a lot of civil servants I've talked to who are working on these files want to make sure that they're not in that position and that they get it right. So we have political will, which I think is crucial, and there is a lot of work to do. But supporting those who actually doing that important work and doing what we can to remove barriers and have different departments and jurisdictions work seamlessly together. I think that'll help speed things up for us.
Mm. You said that you feel that there is political will in Atlantic Canada to bring the sector to life, but do you think government is doing enough? Are they doing all that they need to do to create a favorable environment that will enable the sector to develop the way we want it to? Or do you think they could be, or should be doing more?
Well, I think they can always be doing more, and I don't want to criticize any particular government for any actions or lack of actions because, as I mentioned, we've seen incredible support for the sector, and I think we've seen a lot of progress in a very short period of time. But there certainly is more that can be done, particularly I think on the communications and social license side of this, because right now to me it seems that it's the industry and proponents themselves that are really carrying the majority of the weight on informing and educating the public as to what is going on and why this is valuable and why this it could be valuable to Nova Scotians, Atlantic Canadians. So I think government probably could step up a little bit in that way regarding policy and regulations. Uh, Anything I would say, Arvind probably has already said, and I'm sure developers have been mentioning this to regulatory bodies already. So yeah, there is more that can be done. That said, as we know, there's a lot. Government's dealing with a lot right now. Unexpected trade war with our closest ally. So I think it's reasonable to give them a pass for not doing everything that we want them to do. There, of course, is more, but the more that we take on, like the alliance, for example, the more that we can do to assist and other organizations to help get that word out.
Mm.
That'll help the sector as well.
I I hear some skepticism at times from people, and maybe the root of it goes back to 2022 when German Chancellor Scholz and Prime Minister Trudeau went to Stephenville, Newfoundland, and with great fanfare announced an ambitious target to start shipping green hydrogen from Atlantic Canada to Germany in 2025. And then people point to me and say, well, it's now 2025. Shovels aren't even in the ground yet. We're not building anything, let alone shipping hydrogen to Germany. So I wonder, given that, do you think that policymakers are still fully on board with exporting green hydrogen, or do you think some of them are maybe on the fence or second guessing?
No, I don't think that the delay or not hitting the end of 2025 mark is an indication of waning support from policy and decision makers. I think it simply is, dealing with the reality of getting these major projects and agreements confirmed. It's a lot of work. I worked for Everwind Fuels for over a year, and saw a little bit of behind the scenes of what it actually takes to move mountains, essentially. So um, I can tell you there's no lack of appetite or desire on the developer side to move and move as quickly as possible, and there's a lot of effort going in on that end. And I don't think it's waning on government side. Like I said, priorities have shifted in a way. We were a few years ago talking about the potential of adding a new industry and being able to export green hydrogen. to new markets in Europe. And now maybe we're thinking we have to be looking at moving everything to Europe or broadening our trade. So, I think things have somewhat changed for governments. I still see the enthusiasm and the commitments to support the sector. But the landscape has shifted, and there are other things that maybe are taking more attention away. But I think we just need to keep our nose to the grindstone and keep moving forward.
Yeah. I want to move on then from policies and regulations and talk a little bit about customer demand. And Arvind, this is an area where I know you have some experience where, heavy transportation applications like long-haul trucking and buses and marine vessels are often mentioned as some of the best uses for hydrogen as an alternative to fossil fuels, both here in Atlantic Canada and in other places. I know your team at Deloitte has done some work specifically in the heavy transportation sector. I'm interested in your thoughts about some of the hurdles to adoption of hydrogen in the transportation sector and how you think we might be able to overcome them.
Yeah, sure. That's certainly an important question that we're trying to answer and trying to help the industry overcome some of those barriers to be able to scale up demand and adoption, especially in these sectors, especially long haul transportation, where there are some limitations on the battery electric side. I think the one thing I'll point out is, unlike electricity, where infrastructure is established from production, distribution, transmission, in case of hydrogen, a new value chain has to be established in many cases. So the production of hydrogen, distribution, storage, and to be able to move it cost effectively. So having said that, I think the price of hydrogen delivered to the truck still continues to be expensive in many cases. Never mind the carbon intensity associated with that production of hydrogen, whether you look at it as a blue hydrogen or a green hydrogen or any technology, still continues to be expensive. The price of the truck is still what we have seen last is still continues to be quite high, almost 3 times or 2 times the price of conventional diesel truck. Lack of a hydrogen refueling infrastructure along major transportation corridor routes, and also availability of OEM offerings and dealer readiness. So there is these hurdles still have been talked about long. They still continue to remain. So we can kind of start thinking, okay, what can we do to help the industry go along? The one thing I'll point to, Derek, is if you look at the pilot projects around the world, particularly in Europe, such as H2 Accelerate, even the hydrogen H-Tech Gateway project in British Columbia, they have successfully demonstrated the use of hydrogen trucks at scale and signify the importance of public-private partnership as a key component to scale adoption. And specifically, what we mean by that is really bringing together supply and demand side consortiums together, the fleets, the dealers, the OEMs, the infra service providers, the suppliers, and also having supportive policies. And we got to start looking at it from hydrogen hubs and corridors across strategic corridors like Edmonton, Calgary, or the 401 in Ontario. So within Canada, we've got a lot of strategic corridors where these trucks operate, class 7 and 8 predominantly, and we got to go and strategically target those particular corridors and bring the supply and demand side consortiums together, in our view, to start realizing the economies of scale to scale adoption.
I'm a bit afraid of what your answer to this question is going to be, but I'm going to ask it anyway. You talked about hurdles more related to infrastructure. You got to be able to produce the hydrogen, get it to a refueling station. You need to have a refueling station. You need fuel cell trucks, and they can be expensive. So you've got kind of all that infrastructure hurdle that needs to be overcome. But then you also mentioned that hydrogen is quite expensive, especially if it's low carbon. So given those two sets of hurdles, which one do you think is more significant? What I'm wondering is if we can get over all the infrastructure hurdles, is there a path to adoption, or will the answer still be, well, okay, we've got all the infrastructure figured out, but until we can get the price of hydrogen low enough, we're still not going to see adoption?
Yeah, I think that's a fair observation, Derek. And I think the biggest hurdle still continues to remain price, and it is still quite expensive. However, having said that, I think there are a few creative ways in how we can start thinking about how do we bend the price curve. And as you know, the biggest cost component from production of low carbon hydrogen is from renewable sources, is the price of electricity, or if you produce blue hydrogen, price of natural gas. But if you talk about the price of electricity for a second, I think one of the ways we have been thinking about is how can we look at some market price of energy through a dynamic pricing model, again using technology which can help optimize the electric system and can do some load shifting where during times when there is excess energy, can we allow that energy to shift at a price point that allows electrolyzers to operate during periods of low electricity cost, thereby reducing the overall hydrogen production cost and improving grid stability. So we've been playing around with those kinds of tools and mechanisms, and of course, paired with that, we got to look at specific policies that can enable this, even looking at the technology and infrastructure related costs. You do mention about infrastructure remaining, but even storage and distribution in particular. And the last thing I would say is, government support in more targeted areas of technology innovation at scale. If I look at technologies like methane pyrolysis, so having distributed hydrogen at scale using small scale modular um, methane pyrolysis can also help co-locating supply and demand to help reduce the price barrier.
Adam, if Atlantic Canada is going to become a green energy powerhouse, we're going to have to be, producing green hydrogen at scale, and that also means we're going to need a lot of wind farms, to be able to produce the renewable electricity. And these big infrastructure projects in Atlantic Canada, whether it's a wind farm, a pulp and paper mill, a mine, tidal power, they often face local opposition despite the benefits. And I'm interested in what you think the risk is around green hydrogen, that some of these being big green hydrogen projects in Atlantic Canada might end up some of these other big infrastructure projects where, while there are benefits, they're still controversial, there's still opposition, and then ultimately the projects get delayed until they can sort all of that out, and until you sort of get the social license that's needed to progress.
Yeah, it certainly is something that the sector is experiencing, and I've experienced it directly, having held and run engagement and consultation sessions and have had those conversations with people. And I can tell you, my experience, there's obviously a number of reasons. One kind of unique one that may be unique to Atlantic Canada is there is sometimes a sense of distrust because they've heard all of these stories before. Atlantic Canada through the 80s and 90s especially was experiencing economic depression, and there were a number of projects attempted throughout Atlantic Canada that were seen as economic development projects, and big things supported by government that would help communities that were struggling through the transition. Particularly in Cape Breton with the reduction of production of coal and export of steel. So, a lot of people in these communities, they've heard government come in with these big announcements, and we're going to open a military vehicle plant in Port Hawkesbury, or something else, or they've heard promises from developers, from wind developers or other energy developers, and those developers haven't lived up to their commitments. We definitely have heard quite a bit of that. There have been a number of wind developments in the province that were under development before green hydrogen became a topic of discussion. And from what we've heard from not just constituents and members of the community, but also members of local governments, those developers didn't live up to their commitments. And it created a sense of distrust from big developers, which, I completely understand. So, I think for one thing, developers and the sector as a whole and government need to do a better job of informing communities, um, communicating to them, of listening to them. And that was a big part of my experience in those communities was listening to their concerns and being able to potentially make adjustments to plans based on community feedback. And I think a lot of the opposition for green hydrogen in particular is really wind development opposition. There's active groups that are now opposing green hydrogen that really are kind of a number of anti-wind groups grouped together and changing their message. So, I mean, the reality is a lot of the opposition to the green hydrogen sector is essentially opposition to wind farms. Um, some will say it's NIMBYism. I am one of those people. And it's people have a right to discuss what's going on in their own backyard, and that's completely fine. But unfortunately, I think that there are some of the arguments against the sector that are coming out are not completely accurate, and it can be frustrating to have to deal with some of that misinformation that is put out there. But I think what proponents and what government has to do is continue to communicate to communities, listen to communities, and be open about what we're doing. The most powerful thing I think that can be done is really communicate the benefits that Canadians, and particularly Nova Scotians and Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, will get as a result of the sector.
Right. So on that point that you just made, one of the arguments that we hear sometimes against the big hydrogen export projects is that they don't benefit Atlantic Canada.
Mm.
How do you think that opposition can be overcome?
I don't understand that argument that there's no benefit to Atlantic Canada because we're exporting the fuel. Look at some of the biggest energy exporters in the world. They're also some of the richest jurisdictions in the world. In Canada, look at Alberta. I think they had a $4 billion surplus last year. Texas in the United States. We can look at the UAE as well. Exporting is good for the economy, and it's good for local jobs and it's good for your local residents. It gives local governments and provincial governments money uh, to fix or develop new infrastructure for services like hospitals and education and highways and roads. We talk about Nova Scotia has a trade deficit. We're a net importer as opposed to export, and our economy kind of shows that. One of our biggest success stories in export is seafood, which has grown significantly over the last number of years. I don't hear anybody making the argument that that sector is not benefiting Nova Scotia because lobster is leaving the province, because it doesn't make any sense. We're using a resource, exporting it and bringing in revenue from outside of Nova Scotia's borders. And that's exactly the same thing that we would be doing, of course, with green hydrogen. We're essentially capturing and exporting our wind. And, the argument that the wind power should be dedicated to Nova Scotia's grid first before green hydrogen, that's an interesting one and a little bit more of a complex argument. But the thing is, we know that with the nature of wind energy, it's intermittent and you need to either use it or store it if possible when you have it. We're building a lot of wind in Nova Scotia because there is a lot of wind. There's not as nearly as much demand. So we have some of the best wind in the world. We have some of the best wind resources globally. And we have the opportunity to build enough infrastructure so that we can capture it, storage it, and export it, and still get power for our local grids through those wind farm developments. Because there's always going to be a use for our power. If it was developed only for the grid, it would be used maybe a fifth of the time. Shouldn't quote me on that statistic, but other experts would have a better sense of that. But if those wind turbines were only built to serve the grid, you're only going to be able to use that energy when there's demand, and we know that demand fluctuates. We have an opportunity here to take a resource that is world class, underdeveloped, and be able to capture it, storage it, and export it. And I think it's an incredible opportunity.
We heard Dave McGregor in one of our prior episodes made a similar case, and kind of his uh, case was that producing hydrogen for export and producing hydrogen to use domestically are complementary uses. They don't compete against each other, that we actually have an opportunity to be more successful when we do both. And so I think that's a little bit about what you're saying.
Absolutely.
This has been a really interesting discussion, and to both of you, I really appreciate your candor. It's sometimes not as fun talking about the hurdles as it is talking about all of the opportunities. So let's end this conversation by playing out a couple of what if scenarios. I flipped the coin, and sorry, Arvind, you're going to get the worst case scenario. My question for you is, let's imagine that it's 2035, so 10 years from now, and green hydrogen never took off in Atlantic Canada. What do you think happened, or what do you think would have gone wrong?
Yeah, Derek, it's going to go back to some of the points that I made earlier. I think in this particular case, then maybe the cost of hydrogen, as we had predicted and anticipated to come down, probably did not come down as we anticipated. The sectors that we think and believe hydrogen is well suited to adopt, like heavy transport, industry, production of synthetic fuels to decarbonize marine aviation, were slow to adopt or delayed adoption, inconsistent or insufficient government and policy support through subsidies, incentives, regulatory reforms. So, and the last is again infrastructure challenges. So these are all common threads and challenges that can impact both export and domestic regional demand takeoff. But again, having said all of that, I do believe that as Adam was saying, the opportunities here, it's for us to take. We got to diversify our trading partners. Other nations need access to our resources. So I still believe there is absolutely an opportunity. And I think if we can prioritize policy to target to scale domestic regional demand and export where hydrogen can be prioritized, I really think it's going to be a huge benefit for us.
Okay. Adam, you get to end the pod with the optimistic best case scenario. Similar question. Fast forward to 2035, it's 10 years from now. Atlantic Canada, got over the hurdles, and the hydrogen sector here is a booming industry. What do you think would have happened? What did we get right?
The opposite of what Arvind said, essentially. He mentioned all the crucial figures, one being price. If this is successful 10 years from now, then we figured out how to make the price work, which I think is very likely, considering especially the announcement that Canada and Germany made last summer. We developed infrastructure, signed MOU agreements. I think we probably would have done a better job of working together and across departments and jurisdictions and have governments working together. That would speed things up considerably. And I think something that we didn't really talk about on this episode of the podcast is workforce. That's something that is crucial and still not yet, I think, nailed down because there's huge demand right now for workers in a lot of different sectors. So I think that is probably a crucial piece. How do we have the population base, and how are we housing these people, and how are we making sure that we have the training and education opportunities for our local people to get those jobs? So I think if we've cracked those nuts, we're probably looking good in 2035.
Great. Well, that's an optimistic way to end the podcast. Thanks to both of you. I really appreciate you joining me today. My takeaway from this conversation is that it's pretty clear there are some, pretty significant hurdles that we're going to have to clear. And I'm encouraged to hear that there's reason to be optimistic that we'll be able to get over them. So thank you both here for your time. In this episode of the pod, we heard that while Atlantic Canada is well positioned to be a major player in green hydrogen, being well positioned isn't the same as being ready. First we have to clear some pretty big hurdles. Maria, what big hurdles in today's episode stuck with you?
The biggest hurdle, I guess, would be what we've heard from guests before on this podcast, and that is around price. Green hydrogen is still expensive to produce. It's hard to build demand for hydrogen when it's more expensive than the fossil fuels being used today. But Arvind says that there are ways to bend that cost, like to bend that cost curve, like dynamic electricity pricing. And that's when the electrolyzers, can run renewable power when it's abundant and the price is lower. Hydrogen becomes more affordable when you do it that way, and the grid becomes more stable as well. And the other one is trust. Trust matters, especially here in Atlantic Canada. We've seen a lot of big promises before about big projects to spur economic growth, promises that just didn't deliver. And so with green hydrogen, community engagement, open dialogue, transparency, listening, it's all super important. So how about you, Derek?
Well, one of mine was also a hurdle that we've heard about before on this podcast, and that's the infrastructure problem. With electricity, the wires, and the rest of the infrastructure is already there. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to hydrogen, we're building the entire value chain from scratch, all the way from hydrogen production to pipelines and storage and fueling stations and more. Though even in sectors like heavy transportation, where hydrogen makes a lot of sense, fuel cell trucks cost a lot more than diesel trucks. Hydrogen fuel is expensive, and the refueling stations don't exist yet. Arvind says that's where strategic planning is really important, to focus on key transportation corridors or hubs, use public-private partnerships to build them, and then connect supply and demand in really kind of smart and scalable ways. And my other big takeaway is that none of this works without political will. We heard that anytime there's political uncertainty, there will also be a lot of investor uncertainty. Investors need to know the government support, the funding, policies, and regulatory frameworks will be created and coordinated at all levels of government, and that they will remain longer than a 4-year election cycle. And I guess to wrap up this episode, there's the uncertain bigger picture in Canada and really around the world. There's the risk of escalating war in Europe. We have high inflation, a global trade war now, and shifting government landscapes here in North America and also in Europe. So while addressing climate change is still important, governments are distracted. Hydrogen is still a priority, but it's often not the top one. So I think all of this means that while the potential for hydrogen in Atlantic Canada is real, the road to success is probably going to be complicated.